Cultural heritage is an oft neglected topic. At least, major news media outlets seem only occasionally to report on it, with often lamentable results. Right now, thousands of heritage sites are in danger of severe damage or destruction, particularly in the Middle East, where the U.S. has had no shortage of involvement. One of the most affected nations is Iraq, which since the 1980s has been embroiled in a series of vicious conflicts with little respite. Many remember the Second Gulf War, but do they know how much history was obliterated by its consequences? In this day and age, it is imperative that the U.S. stand with Iraq in protecting its heritage. Historically, our nation has been an arbiter, but that title is not just for warmongers, it is for those who aid as well. During World War II, many historical treasures were vandalized by the Nazis and Allied forces. As a result, the UN set out to create clearer definitions on cultural heritage and the measures that should be taken to protect them during wartime. Though earlier efforts exist, the most important installment in the history of heritage protection is the 1954 Hague or Hague Convention. Here, the nations established what cultural heritage means and how they would protect it. The definition includes movable or immovable property of great importance to the cultural heritage of every people. Under this umbrella lies museums, archives, archaeological sites, artifacts, and manuscripts. The Articles of the Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict is primarily a document on how to respond during wartime, but it remains the most important document in this discussion because war is the number one threat to cultural heritage preservation. When the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, it had been working closely with specialists to develop a plan of invasion that avoided the destruction of important sites. This dream of complete protection, however, fell into pieces once the invasion went into play. The Iraq Museum was tragically looted, and hundreds of archaeological sites were damaged by looters after the Hussein regime collapsed. At first, in denial, top U.S. officials claimed they did all they could. It is just a byproduct of war. Yet, that was not true. Matthew Thurlow, a 2005 JD from Yale, notes that U.S. military manuals at the time gave few special protections to archaeological sites. Quote, thus, American troops have no greater obligation to spare a national museum than to spare a privately owned car dealership. In this sense, cultural heritage sites are no more important than private property. On top of all of this, it needs to be mentioned that the U.S. had not ratified the Hague Convention, and still fails to do so. After the international community got word of the massive destruction that had occurred in Iraq, the U.S. decided to clean up its act. Whereas before the response had been defensive, the United States now took affirmative action to clean up the mess, particularly with the Iraq Museum. The initial response was phenomenal, but it is hard to see it as more than damage control. Experts were still wincing at the situation in 2005, and that reaction is very appropriate today. Since the U.S. has long ceased its major military operations in Iraq, some assume that it has no more obligations to this war-torn country. However, if we take a closer look, it's easy to see that many of Iraq's chronic problems are a result of the Second Gulf War invasion. ISIS may not have been installed by the U.S., but it would never have thrived if the American military had not toppled the Saddam regime. This case for ongoing responsibility is still tenuous, however. A better reason can be found with the nation's deeper obligations to each other. History is a symbol of national and international identity, a vessel for understanding and promoting peace amongst different groups. The sites being vandalized in the Middle East do not just belong to those countries. They are part of a common human inheritance. My first recommendation for U.S. action would be to ratify the Hague Convention. This is not just to protect sites in the event of any future military involvement, but to make sure the U.S. is working with the same terms that other countries are. How we define cultural heritage is crucial to developing a coherent plan for its protection. It is also advisable that military manuals are all thoroughly updated to reflect the prioritization of archaeological sites. Only once the U.S. roots itself in a commitment to heritage protection can it enact effective policy. One of the principal issues for protecting historical sites is the lack of consistency. Spurts of intense help, like after the Iraq Museum looting, do nothing to create sustained change. In the recent past, there have been more intense efforts to create this, but we have yet to see the fruits of a very consistent program. As part of a legal symposium held in Baghdad earlier this year, Professor of International Law Nabil Mad Ala Al Obeidi presented a paper on how to better protect Iraqi heritage, laying out 15 key points in his conclusion. None of these recommendations for action involve the efforts of only one nation. These endeavors have to be collaborative, immediate, and robust. Perhaps the most important recommendation of Al Obeidi's is for preparing international conventions that bear the character of legal obligation to protect cultural heritage and considering it as an integral part of the common human heritage. This is not some globalist fantasy. It is necessary for us to preserve our history. Hence, the main step that the U.S. should be taking is to ensure that the value of historically significant artifacts and sites are enshrined in its own law, and to see their defense as more than the responsibility of the nation that they are in. This type of agenda certainly never shows up on the public opinion polls or ballots in the U.S. Most Americans and Europeans, for that matter, are too blissfully unaware to devote time or energy to the cause. But through growing international pressure and a realization of the nation's responsibilities to each other, this issue will hopefully become more visible as change is enacted. The key to preserving the world's history lies not in the action of one country, like the U.S., but the ability of it and many other nations to work consistently toward a common goal.